Section 37 of Germinal by Emile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Part 7, Chapter 3. At 4 o'clock the descent began. Dansaert, who was personally installed at the marker's office in the lamp cabin, wrote down the name of each worker who presented himself and had a lamp given to him. He took them all, without remark, keeping to the promise of the placards. When, however, he noticed Étienne and Catherine at the wicket, he started and became very red, and was opening his mouth to refuse their names. Then he contented himself with the triumph and a jeer. Ah, ah! So the strong man was thrown! The Company was, then, in luck, since the terrible Montsou wrestler had come back to it to ask for bread? Étienne silently took his lamp and went towards the shaft with the putter. But it was there, in the receiving room, that Catherine feared the mate's bad words. At the very entrance she recognized Chaval, in the midst of some 20 miners, waiting till a cage was free. He came furiously towards her, but the sight of Étienne stopped him. Then he affected to sneer with an offensive shrug of the shoulders. Very good. He didn't care a hang, since the other had come to occupy the place that was still warm. Good riddance. It only concerned the gentleman if he liked the leavings. And beneath the exhibition of this contempt he was again seized by a tremor of jealousy, and his eyes flamed. For the rest, the mates did not stir, standing silent, with eyes lowered. They contented themselves with casting a sidelong look at the newcomers. Then, dejected and without anger, they again stared fixedly at the mouth of the shaft, with their lamps in their hands, shivering beneath their thin jackets, in the constant draughts of this large room. At last the cage was wedged on to the keeps, and they were ordered to get in. Catherine and Étienne were squeezed in one tram, already containing Pierron and 2 pikemen. Beside them, in the other tram, Chaval was loudly saying to Father Mouque that the directors had made a mistake in not taking advantage of the opportunity to free the pits of the blackguards who were corrupting them. But the old groom, who had already fallen back into the dog-like resignation of his existence, no longer grew angry over the death of his children, and simply replied by a gesture of conciliation. The cage freed itself and slipped down into the darkness. No one spoke. Suddenly, when they were in the middle third of the descent, there was a terrible jarring. The iron creaked, and the men were thrown on to each other. "By God!" growled Étienne, "are they going to flatten us? We shall end by being left here for good, with their confounded tubbing. And they talk about having repaired it!" The cage had, however, cleared the obstacle. It was now descending beneath so violent a rain, like a storm, that the workmen anxiously listened to the pouring. A number of leaks must then have appeared in the caulking of the joints. Pierron, who had been working for several days, when asked about it, did not like to show his fear, which might be considered as an attack on the management. So he only replied: "Oh, no danger! It's always like that. No doubt they've not had time to caulk the leaks." The torrent was roaring over their heads, and they at last reached the pit eye beneath a veritable waterspout. Not one of the captains had thought of climbing up the ladders to investigate the matter. The pump would be enough. The carpenters would examine the joints the following night. The reorganization of work in the galleries gave considerable trouble. Before allowing the pikemen to return to their hewing cells, the engineer had decided that for the first 5 days all the men should execute certain works of consolidation which were extremely urgent. Landslips were threatening everywhere. The passages had suffered to such an extent that the timbering had to be repaired along a length of several hundred metres. Gangs of 10 men were therefore formed below, each beneath the control of a captain. Then they were set to work at the most damaged spots. When the descent was complete, it was found that 322 miners had gone down, about half of those who worked there when the pit was in full swing. Chaval belonged to the same gang as Catherine and Étienne. This was not by chance. He had at first hidden behind his mates, and had then forced the captain's hand. This gang went to the end of the north gallery, nearly 3 kilometres away, to clear out a landslip which was stopping up a gallery in the 18 Pouces seam. They attacked the fallen rocks with shovel and pick. Étienne, Chaval, and 5 others cleared away the rubbish, while Catherine, with 2 trammers, wheeled the earth up to the up brow. They seldom spoke, and the captain never left them. The putter's 2 lovers, however, were on the point of coming to blows. While growling that he had had enough of this trollop, Chaval was still thinking of her and slyly hustling her about, so that Étienne had threatened to settle him if he did not leave her alone. They eyed each other fiercely and had to be separated. Towards 8 o'clock Dansaert passed to give a glance at the work. He appeared to be in a very bad humour, and was furious with the captain. Nothing had gone well. What was the meaning of such work? The planking would everywhere have to be done over again. And he went away declaring that he would come back with the engineer. He had been waiting for Négrel since morning, and could not understand the cause of this delay. Another hour passed by. The captain had stopped the removal of the rubbish to employ all his people in supporting the roof. Even the putter and the 2 trammers left off wheeling to prepare and bring pieces of timber. At this end of the gallery the gang formed a sort of advance guard, at the very extremity of the mine, now without communication with the other stalls. 3 or 4 times strange noises, distant rushes, made the workers turn their heads to listen. What was it then? One would have said that the passages were being emptied and the mates already returning at a running pace. But the sound was lost in the deep silence, and they set to wedging their wood again, dazed by the loud blows of the hammer. At last they returned to the rubbish, and the wheeling began once more. Catherine came back from her first journey in terror, saying that no one was to be found at the upbrow. I called, but there was no reply. They've all cleared out of the place. The bewilderment was so great that the 10 men threw down their tools to rush away. The idea that they were abandoned, left alone at the bottom of the mine, so far from the pit eye, drove them wild. They only kept their lamps and ran in single file. The men, the boys, the putter, the captain himself lost his head and shouted out appeals, more and more frightened at the silence in this endless desert of galleries. What then had happened, that they did not meet a soul? What accident could thus have driven away their mates? Their terror was increased by the uncertainty of the danger, this threat which they felt there without knowing what it was. When they at last came near the pit eye, a torrent barred their road. They were at once in water to the knees, and were no longer able to run, laboriously fording the flood, with the thought that 1 minute's delay might mean death. "By God! it's the tubbing that's given way!" cried Étienne. "I said we should be left here for good." Since the descent, Pierron had anxiously observed the increase of the deluge which fell from the shaft. As with 2 others he loaded the trams he raised his head, his face covered with large drops, and his ears ringing with the roar of the tempest above. But he trembled especially when he noticed that the sump beneath him, that pit 10 metres deep, was filling. The water was already spurting through the floor and covering the metal plates. This showed that the pump was no longer sufficient to fight against the leaks. He heard it panting, with the groan of fatigue. Then he warned Dansaert, who swore angrily, replying that they must wait for the engineer. Twice he returned to the charge, without extracting anything else but exasperated shrugs of the shoulder. Well, the water was rising. What could he do? Mouque appeared with Bataille, whom he was leading to work, and he had to hold him with both hands, for the sleepy old horse had suddenly reared up, and with a shrill neigh was stretching his head towards the shaft. Well, philosopher, what troubles you? Ah, it's because it rains. Come along, that doesn't concern you." But the beast quivered all over his skin, and Mouque forcibly drew him to the haulage gallery. Almost at the same moment as Mouque and Bataille were disappearing at the end of a gallery, there was a crackling in the air, followed by the prolonged noise of a fall. It was a piece of tubbing which had got loose and was falling 180 metres down, rebounding against the walls. Pierron and the other porters were able to get out of the way, and the oak plank only smashed an empty tram. At the same time a mass of water, the leaping flood of a broken dike, rushed down. Dansaert proposed to go up and examine, but while he was still speaking another piece rolled down, and in terror before the threatening catastrophe he no longer hesitated, but gave the order to go up, sending captains to warn the men in their stalls. Then a terrible hustling began. From every gallery rows of workers came rushing up, trying to take the cages by assault. They crushed madly against each other in order to be taken up at once. Some who had thought of trying the ladder passage came down again shouting that it was already stopped up. That was the terror they all felt each time that the cage rose. This time it was able to pass, but who knew if it would be able to pass again in the midst of the obstacles obstructing the shaft? The downfall must be continuing above, for a series of low detonations was heard. The planks were splitting and bursting amid the continuous and increasing roar of a storm. One cage soon became useless, broken in and no longer sliding between the guides, which were doubtless broken. The other jarred to such a degree that the cable would certainly break soon, and there remained 100 men to be taken up, all panting, clinging to one another, bleeding and half drowned. 2 were killed by falls of planking. A third, who had seized the cage, fell back 50 metres up and disappeared in the sump. Dansaert, however, was trying to arrange matters in an orderly manner. Armed with a pick, he threatened to open the skull of the first man who refused to obey, and he tried to arrange them in file, shouting that the porters were to go up last after having sent up their mates. He was not listened to, and he had to prevent the pale and cowardly Pierron from entering among the first. At each departure he pushed him aside with a blow, but his own teeth were chattering. A minute more and he would be swallowed up. Everything was smashing up there. A flood had broken loose, a murderous rain of scaffolding. A few men were still running up when, mad with fear, he jumped into a tram, allowing Pierron to jump in behind him. The cage rose. At this moment the gang to which Étienne and Chaval belonged had just reached the pit eye. They saw the cage disappear and rushed forward, but they had to draw back from the final downfall of the tubbing. The shaft was stopped up and the cage would not come down again. Catherine was sobbing, and Chaval was choked with shouting oaths. There were 20 of them. Were those bloody bosses going to abandon them thus? Father Mouque, who had brought back Bataille without hurrying, was still holding him by the bridle, both of them stupefied, the man and the beast, in the face of this rapid flow of the inundation. The water was already rising to their thighs. Étienne, in silence, with clenched teeth, supported Catherine between his arms, and the 20 yelled with their faces turned up, obstinately gazing at the shaft like imbeciles, that shifting hole which was belching out a flood and from which no help could henceforth come to them. At the surface, Dansaert, on arriving, perceived Négrel running up. By some fatality Madame Hennebeau had that morning delayed him on rising, turning over the leaves of catalogues for the purchase of wedding presents. It was 10 o'clock. "Well, what's happening then?" he shouted from afar. "The pit is ruined," replied the head captain, and he described the catastrophe in a few stammered words, while the engineer incredulously shrugged his shoulders. What? Could tubbing be demolished like that? They were exaggerating. He would make an examination. "I suppose no one has been left at the bottom?" Dansaert was confused. No, no one, at least so he hoped, but some of the men might have been delayed. "But," said Négrel, "what in the name of creation have you come up for, then? You can't leave your men." He immediately gave orders to count the lamps. In the morning 322 had been distributed, and now only 255 could be found. But several men acknowledged that in the hustling and panic they had dropped theirs and left them behind. An attempt was made to call over the men, but it was impossible to establish the exact number. Some of the miners had gone away, others did not hear their names. No one was agreed as to the number of the missing mates. It might be 20, perhaps 40. And the engineer could only make out one thing with certainty. There were men down below, for their yells could be distinguished through the sound of the water and the fallen scaffolding, on leaning over the mouth of the shaft. Négrel's first care was to send for M. Hennebeau and to try to close the pit, but it was already too late. The colliers who had rushed to the Deux Cent Quarante settlement, as though pursued by the cracking tubbing, had frightened the families, and bands of women, old men, and little ones came running up, shaken by cries and sobs. They had to be pushed back, and a line of overseers was formed to keep them off, for they would have interfered with the operations. Many of the men who had come up through the shaft remained there stupidly without thinking of changing their clothes, riveted by fear before this terrible hole in which they had nearly remained for ever. The women, rushing wildly around them, implored them for names. Was so and so among them, and that one, and this one? They did not know, they stammered. They shuddered terribly and made gestures like madmen, gestures which seemed to be pushing away some abominable vision which was always present to them. The crowd rapidly increased, and lamentations arose from the roads. And up there on the pit bank, in Bonnemort's cabin, on the ground, was seated a man, Souvarine, who had not gone away, who was looking on. "The names! The names!" cried the women, with voices choked by tears. Négrel appeared for a moment, and said hurriedly: "As soon as we know the names they shall be given out, but nothing is lost so far. Every one will be saved. I am going down." Then, silent with anguish, the crowd waited. The engineer, in fact, with quiet courage, was preparing to go down. He had had the cage unfastened, giving orders to replace it at the end of the cable by a tub; and as he feared that the water would extinguish his lamp, he had another fastened beneath the tub, which would protect it. Several captains, trembling and with white, disturbed faces, assisted in these preparations. "You will come with me, Dansaert," said Négrel abruptly. Then, when he saw them all without courage, and that the head captain was tottering, giddy with terror, he pushed him aside with a movement of contempt. "No, you will be in my way. I would rather go alone." He was already in the narrow bucket which swayed at the end of the cable, and holding his lamp in one hand and the signal cord in the other, he shouted to the engine man: "Gently!" The engine set the drums in movement, and Négrel disappeared in the gulf, from which the yells of the wretches below still arose. At the upper part nothing had moved. He found that the tubbing here was in good condition. Balanced in the middle of the shaft, he lighted up the walls as he turned around. The leaks between the joints were so slight that his lamp did not suffer. But at 300 metres, when he reached the lower tubbing, the lamp was extinguished, as he expected, for a jet had filled the tub. After that he was only able to see by the hanging lamp which preceded him in the darkness, and in spite of his courage he shuddered and turned pale in the face of the horror of the disaster. A few pieces of timber alone remained, the others had fallen in with their frames. Behind, enormous cavities had been hollowed out, and the yellow sand, as fine as flour, was flowing in considerable masses, while the waters of the torrent, that subterranean sea with its unknown tempests and shipwrecks, were discharging in a flow like a weir. He went down lower, lost in the midst of these chasms which continued to multiply, beaten and turned round by the waterspout of the springs, so badly lighted by the red star of the lamp moving on below, that he seemed to distinguish the roads and squares of some destroyed town far away in the play of the great moving shadows. No human work was any longer possible. His only remaining hope was to attempt to save the men in peril. As he sank down he heard the cries becoming louder, and he was obliged to stop. An impassable obstacle barred the shaft, a mass of scaffolding, the broken joists of the guides, the split brattices, entangled with the metalwork torn from the pump. As he looked on for a long time with aching heart, the yelling suddenly ceased. No doubt the rapid rise of the water had forced the wretches to flee into the galleries, if, indeed, the flood had not already filled their mouths. Négrel resigned himself to pulling the signal cord as a sign to draw up. Then he had himself stopped again. He could not conceive the cause of this sudden accident. He wished to investigate it, and examine those pieces of the tubbing which were still in place. At a distance the tears and cuts in the wood had surprised him. His lamp, drowned in dampness, was going out, and, touching with his fingers, he clearly recognized the marks of the saw and of the wimble, the whole abominable labour of destruction. Evidently this catastrophe had been intentionally produced. He was stupefied. And the pieces of timber, cracking and falling down with their frames in a last slide, nearly carried him with them. His courage fled. The thought of the man who had done that made his hair stand on end, and froze him with a supernatural fear of evil, as though, mixed with the darkness, the men were still there, paying for his immeasurable crime. He shouted and shook the cord furiously. And it was, indeed, time, for he perceived that the upper tubbing, 100 metres higher, was in its turn beginning to move. The joints were opening, losing their oakum caulking, and streams were rushing through. It was now only a question of hours before the tubbing would all fall down. At the surface, M. Hennebeau was anxiously waiting for Négrel. "Well, what?" he asked. But the engineer was choked, and could not speak. He felt faint. "It is not possible! Such a thing was never seen. Have you examined?" He nodded with a cautious look. He refused to talk in the presence of some captains who were listening, and he led his uncle 10 metres away, and not thinking this far enough, drew still farther back. Then in a low whisper he at last told of the outrage, the torn and sawn planks, the pit bleeding at the neck and groaning. Turning pale, the manager also lowered his voice, with that instinctive need of silence in face of the monstrosity of great orgies and great crimes. It was useless to look as though they were trembling before the 10,000 Montsou men. Later on they would see. And they both continued whispering, overcome at the thought that a man had had the courage to go down, to hang in the midst of space, to risk his life 20 times over in his terrible task. They could not even understand this mad courage in destruction. They refused to believe, in spite of the evidence, just as we doubt those stories of celebrated escapes of prisoners who fly through windows 30 metres above the ground. When M. Hennebeau came back to the captains, a nervous spasm was drawing his face. He made a gesture of despair, and gave orders that the mine should be evacuated at once. It was a kind of funeral procession, in silent abandonment, with glances thrown back at those great masses of bricks, empty and still standing, but which nothing henceforth could save. And as the manager and the engineer came down last from the receiving room, the crowd met them with its clamour, repeating obstinately, "The names! The names! Tell us the names!" Maheude was now there, among the women. She recollected the noise in the night. Her daughter and the lodger must have gone away together, and they were certainly down at the bottom. And after having cried that it was a good thing, that they deserved to stay there, the heartless cowards, she had run up, and was standing in the first row, trembling with anguish. Besides, she no longer dared to doubt. The discussion going on around her informed her as to the names of those who were down. Yes, yes, Catherine was among them. Étienne also, a mate had seen them. But there was not always agreement with regard to the others. No, not this one; on the contrary, that one, perhaps Chaval, with whom, however, a trammer declared that he had ascended. The Levaque and Pierron, although none of their people were in danger, cried out and lamented as loudly as the others. Zacharie, who had come up among the first in spite of his inclination to make fun of everything, had weepingly kissed his wife and mother, and remained near the latter, quivering and showing an unexpected degree of affection for his sister, refusing to believe that she was below so long as the bosses made no authoritative statement. "The names! The names! For pity's sake, the names!" Négrel, who was exhausted, shouted to the overseers. "Can't you make them be still? It's enough to kill one with vexation. We don't know the names." 2 hours passed away in this manner. In the first terror no one had thought of the other shaft at the old Réquillart mine. M. Hennebeau was about to announce that the rescue would be attempted from that side, when a rumour ran round. 5 men had just escaped the inundation by climbing up the rotten ladders of the old unused passage, and Father Mouque was named. This caused surprise, for no one knew he was below. But the narrative of the 5 who had escaped increased the weeping. 15 mates had not been able to follow them, having gone astray, and being walled up by falls; and it was no longer possible to assist them, for there were already 10 metres of water in Réquillart. All the names were known, and the air was filled with the groans of a slaughtered multitude. "Will you make them be still?" Négrel repeated furiously. "Make them draw back. Yes, yes, to 100 metres. There is danger. Push them back, push them back." It was necessary to struggle against these poor people. They were imagining all sorts of misfortunes, and they had to be driven away so that the deaths might be concealed. The captains explained to them that the shaft would destroy the whole mine. This idea rendered them mute with terror, and they at last allowed themselves to be driven back step by step. The guards, however, who kept them back had to be doubled, for they were fascinated by the spot and continually returned. Thousands of people were hustling each other along the road. They were running up from all the settlements, and even from Montsou. And the man above, on the pit bank, the fair man with the girlish face, smoked cigarettes to occupy himself, keeping his clear eyes fixed on the pit. Then the wait began. It was midday. No one had eaten, but no one moved away. In the misty sky, of a dirty grey colour, rusty clouds were slowly passing by. A big dog, behind Rasseneur's hedge, was barking furiously without cessation, irritated by the living breath of the crowd. And the crowd had gradually spread over the neighbouring ground, forming a circle at 100 metres round the pit. The Voreux arose in the centre of the great space. There was not a soul there, not a sound. It was a desert. The windows and the doors, left open, showed the abandonment within. A forgotten ginger cat, divining the peril in this solitude, jumped from a staircase and disappeared. No doubt the stoves of the boilers were scarcely extinguished, for the tall brick chimney gave out a light smoke beneath the dark clouds, while the weathercock on the steeple creaked in the wind with a short, shrill cry, the only melancholy voice of these vast buildings which were about to die. At 2 o'clock nothing had moved. M. Hennebeau, Négrel, and other engineers who had hastened up, formed a group in black coats and hats, standing in front of the crowd. And they, too, did not move away, though their legs were aching with fatigue, and they were feverish and ill at their impotence in the face of such a disaster, only whispering occasional words, as though at a dying person's bedside. The upper tubbing must nearly all have fallen in, for sudden echoing sounds could be heard as of deep broken falls, succeeded by silence. The wound was constantly enlarging. The landslip, which had begun below, was rising and approaching the surface. Négrel was seized by nervous impatience. He wanted to see, and he was already advancing alone into this awful void, when he was seized by the shoulders. What was the good? He could prevent nothing. An old miner, however, circumventing the overseers, rushed into the shed. but he quietly reappeared. He had gone for his sabots. 3 o'clock struck. Still nothing. A falling shower had soaked the crowd, but they had not withdrawn a step. Rasseneur's dog had begun to bark again, and it was at 20 minutes past 3 only that the first shock was felt. The Voreux trembled, but continued solid and upright. Then a second shock followed immediately, and a long cry came from open mouths. The tarred screening shed, after having tottered twice, had fallen down with a terrible crash. Beneath the enormous pressure the structures broke and jarred each other so powerfully that sparks leapt out. From this moment the earth continued to tremble. The shocks succeeded one another, subterranean downfalls, the rumbling of a volcano in eruption. Afar the dog was no longer barking, but he howled plaintively, as though announcing the oscillations which he felt coming. And the women, the children, all the people who were looking on, could not keep back a clamour of distress at each of these blows which shook them. In less than 10 minutes the slate roof of the steeple fell in. The receiving room and the engine rooms were split open, leaving a considerable breach. Then the sounds ceased, the downfall stopped, and there was again deep silence. For an hour the Voreux remained thus, broken into, as though bombarded by an army of barbarians. There was no more crying out. The enlarged circle of spectators merely looked on. Beneath the piled up beams of the sifting shed, fractured tipping cradles could be made out with broken and twisted hoppers. But the rubbish had especially accumulated at the receiving room, where there had been a rain of bricks, and large portions of wall and masses of plaster had fallen in. The iron scaffold which bore the pulleys had bent, half buried in the pit. A cage was still suspended, a torn cable end was hanging. Then there was a hash of trams, metal plates and ladders. By some chance the lamp cabin remained standing, exhibiting on the left its bright rows of little lamps. And at the end of its disembowelled chamber the engine could be seen seated squarely on its massive foundation of masonry. Its copper was shining, and its huge steel limbs seemed to possess indestructible muscles. The enormous crank, bent in the air, looked like the powerful knee of some giant quietly reposing in his strength. After this hour of respite, M. Hennebeau's hopes began to rise. The movement of the soil must have come to an end, and there would be some chance of saving the engine and the remainder of the buildings. But he would not yet allow any one to approach, considering another half hour's patience desirable. This waiting became unbearable. The hope increased the anguish, and all hearts were beating quickly. A dark cloud, growing large at the horizon, hastened the twilight, a sinister dayfall over this wreck of earth's tempests. Since 7 o'clock they had been there without moving or eating. And suddenly, as the engineers were cautiously advancing, a supreme convulsion of the soil put them to flight. Subterranean detonations broke out. A whole monstrous artillery was cannonading in the gulf. At the surface the last buildings were tipped over and crushed. At first a sort of whirlpool carried away the rubbish from the sifting shed and the receiving room. Next, the boiler building burst and disappeared. Then it was the low square tower, where the pumping engine was groaning, which fell on its face like a man mown down by a bullet. And then a terrible thing was seen. The engine, dislocated from its massive foundation with broken limbs, was struggling against death. It moved, it straightened its crank, its giant's knee, as though to rise. But, crushed and swallowed up, it was dying. The chimney alone, 30 meters high, still remained standing, though shaken, like a mast in the tempest. It was thought that it would be crushed to fragments and fly to powder, when suddenly it sank in one block, drunk down by the earth, melted like a colossal candle, and nothing was left, not even the point of the lightning conductor. It was done for. The evil beast crouching in this hole, gorged with human flesh, was no longer breathing with its thick, long respiration. The Voreux had been swallowed whole by the abyss. The crowd rushed away yelling. The women hid their eyes as they ran. Terror drove the men along like a pile of dry leaves. They wished not to shout and they shouted, with swollen breasts and arms in the air, before the immense hole which had been hollowed out. This crater, as of an extinct volcano, 15 meters deep, extended from the road to the canal for a space of at least 40 meters. The whole square of the mine had followed the buildings, the gigantic platforms, the foot bridges with their rails, a complete train of trams, 3 wagons, without counting the wood supply, a forest of cut timber, gulped down like straw. At the bottom it was only possible to distinguish a confused mass of beams, bricks, iron, plaster, frightful remains, piled up, entangled, soiled in the fury of the catastrophe. And the hole became larger. Cracks started from the edges, reaching afar, across the fields. A fissure ascended as far as Rasseneur's bar, and his front wall had cracked. Would the settlement itself pass into it? How far ought they to flee, to reach shelter at the end of this abominable day, beneath this leaden cloud which also seemed about to crush the earth? A cry of pain escaped Négrel. M. Hennebeau, who had drawn back, was in tears. The disaster was not complete. One bank of the canal gave way, and the canal emptied itself like one bubbling sheet through one of the cracks. It disappeared there, falling like a cataract down a deep valley. The mine drank down this river. The galleries would now be submerged for years. Soon the crater was filled, and a lake of muddy water occupied the place where once stood the Voreux, like one of those lakes beneath which sleep accursed towns. There was a terrified silence, and nothing now could be heard but the fall of this water rumbling in the bowels of the earth. Then on the shaken pit bank, Souvarine rose up. He had recognized Maheude and Zacharie sobbing before this downfall, the weight of which was so heavy on the heads of the wretches who were in agony beneath. And he threw down his last cigarette. He went away, without looking back, into the now dark night. Afar his shadow diminished and mingled with the darkness. He was going over there, to the unknown. He was going tranquilly to extermination, wherever there might be dynamite to blow up towns and men. He will be there, without doubt, when the middle class in agony shall hear the pavement of the streets bursting up beneath their feet. End of section 37. Section 38 of Germinal by Emile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Part 7, Chapter 4. On the night that followed the collapse of the Voreux, M. Hennebeau started for Paris, wishing to inform the directors in person before the newspapers published the news. And when he returned on the following day, he appeared to be quite calm, with his usual correct administrative air. He had evidently freed himself from responsibility. He did not appear to have decreased in favour. On the contrary, the decree appointing him officer of the Legion of Honour was signed 24 hours afterwards. But if the manager remained safe, the company was tottering beneath the terrible blow. It was not the few million francs that had been lost. It was the wound in the flank, the deep incessant fear of the morrow in face of this massacre of one of their mines. The company was so impressed that once more it felt the need of silence. What was the good of stirring up this abomination? If the villain were discovered, why make a martyr of him, in order that his awful heroism might turn other heads, and give birth to a long line of incendiaries and murderers? Besides, the real culprit was not suspected. The company came to think that there was an army of accomplices, not being able to believe that a single man could have had courage and strength for such a task. And it was precisely this thought which weighed on them, this thought of an ever increasing threat to the existence of their mines. The manager had received orders to organize a vast system of espionage, and then to dismiss quietly, one by one, the dangerous men who were suspected of having had a hand in the crime. They contented themselves with this method of purification, a prudent and politic method. There was only one immediate dismissal, that of Dansaert, the head captain. Ever since the scandal at Pierron's house he had become impossible. A pretext was made of his attitude in danger, the cowardice of a captain abandoning his men. This was also a prudent sop thrown to the miners, who hated him. Among the public, however, many rumours had circulated, and the directors had to send a letter of correction to one newspaper, contradicting a story in which mention was made of a barrel of powder lighted by the strikers. After a rapid inquiry the government inspector had concluded that there had been a natural rupture of the tubbing, occasioned by the piling up of the soil, and the Company had preferred to be silent, and to accept the blame of a lack of superintendence. In the Paris press, after the third day, the catastrophe had served to increase the stock of general news. Nothing was talked of but the men perishing at the bottom of the mine, and the telegrams published every morning were eagerly read. At Montsou people grew pale and speechless at the very name of the Voreux, and a legend had formed which made the boldest tremble as they whispered it. The whole country showed great pity for the victims. Visits were organized to the destroyed pit, and whole families hastened up to shudder at the ruins which lay so heavily over the heads of the buried wretches. Deneulin, who had been appointed divisional engineer, came into the midst of the disaster on beginning his duties, and his first care was to turn the canal back into its bed, for this torrent increased the damage every hour. Extensive works were necessary, and he at once set 100 men to construct a dike. Twice over, the impetuosity of the stream carried away the first dams. Now pumps were set up, and a furious struggle was going on. Step by step the vanished soil was being violently reconquered. But the rescue of the engulfed miners was a still more absorbing work. Négrel was appointed to attempt a supreme effort, and arms were not lacking to help him. All the colliers rushed to offer themselves in an outburst of brotherhood. They forgot the strike, they did not trouble themselves at all about payment, they might get nothing, they only asked to risk their lives as soon as there were mates in danger of death. They were all there with their tools, quivering as they waited to know where they ought to strike, many of them sick with fright after the accident, shaken by nervous tremors, soaked in cold sweats, and the prey of continual nightmares, got up in spite of everything, and were as eager as any in their desire to fight against the earth, as though they had a revenge to take on it. Unfortunately, the difficulty began when the question arose: what could be done? How could they go down? From what side could they attack the rocks? Négrel's opinion was that not one of the unfortunate people was alive. The 15 had surely perished, drowned or suffocated. But in these mine catastrophes the rule is always to assume that buried men are alive, and he acted on this supposition. The first problem which he proposed to himself was to decide where they could have taken refuge. The captains and old miners whom he consulted were agreed on one point. In the face of the rising water the men had certainly come up from gallery to the highest cuttings, so that they were, without doubt, driven to the end of some upper passages. This agreed with Father Mouque's information, and his confused narrative even gave reason to suppose that in the wild flight the band had separated into smaller groups, leaving fugitives on the road at every level. But the captains were not unanimous when the discussion of possible attempts at rescue arose. As the passages nearest to the surface were 150 metres down, there could be no question of sinking a shaft. Réquillart remained the one means of access, the only point by which they could approach. The worst was that the old pit, now also inundated, no longer communicated with the Voreux, and above the level of the water only a few ends of galleries belonging to the first level were left free. The pumping process would require years. and the best plan would be to visit these galleries and ascertain if any of them approached the submerged passages at the end of which the distressed miners were suspected to be. Before logically arriving at this point, much discussion had been necessary to dispose of a crowd of impracticable plans. Négrel now began to stir up the dust of the archives. He discovered the old plans of the two pits, studied them, and decided on the points at which their investigations ought to be carried on. Gradually this hunt excited him. He was, in his turn, seized by a fever of devotion, in spite of his ironical indifference to men and things. The first difficulty was in going down at Réquillart. It was necessary to clear out the rubbish from the mouth of the shaft, to cut down the mountain ash, and raise the sloes and the hawthorns. They had also to repair the ladders. Then they began to feel around. The engineer, having gone down with 10 workmen, made them strike the iron of their tools against certain parts of the seam which he pointed out to them, and in deep silence they each placed an ear to the coal, listening for any distant blows to reply. But they went in vain through every practicable gallery. No echo returned to them. Their embarrassment increased. At what spot should they cut into the bed? Towards whom should they go, since no once appeared to be there? They persisted in seeking, however, notwithstanding the exhaustion produced by their growing anxiety. On the first day Maheude came in the morning to Réquillart. She sat down on a beam in front of the shaft, and did not stir from it till evening. When a man came up, she rose and questioned him with her eyes. Nothing? No, nothing. And she sat down again, and waited still, without a word, with hard, fixed face. Jeanlin also, seeing that his den was invaded, prowled around with the frightened air of a beast of prey whose burrow will betray his booty. He thought of the little soldier lying beneath the rocks, fearing lest they should trouble his sound sleep. But that side of the mine was beneath the water, and, besides, their investigations were directed more to the left, in the west gallery. At first Philoméne had also come, accompanying Zacharie, who was one of the gang. Then she became wearied at catching cold, without need or result, and went back to the settlement, dragging through her days, a limp, indifferent woman, occupied from morning to night in coughing. Zacharie, on the contrary, lived for nothing else. He would have devoured the soil to get back his sister. At night he shouted out that he saw her, he heard her, very lean from hunger, her chest sore with calling for help. Twice he had tried to dig without orders, saying that it was there, that he was sure of it. The engineer would not let him go down any more, and he would not go away from the pit, from which he was driven off. He could not even sit down and wait near his mother, he was so deeply stirred by the need to act, which drove him constantly on. It was the third day. Négrel, in despair, had resolved to abandon the attempt in the evening. At midday, after lunch, when he came back with his men to make one last effort, he was surprised to see Zacharie, red and gesticulating, come out of the mine shouting: "She's there! She's replied to me! Come along, quickly!" He had slid down the ladders, in spite of the watchman, and was declaring that he had heard hammering over there, in the first passage of the Guillaume seam. "But we have already been twice in that direction," Négrel observed sceptically. "Anyhow, we'll go and see." Maheude had risen, and had to be prevented from going down. She waited, standing at the edge of the shaft, gazing down into the darkness of the hole. Négrel, down below, himself struck 3 blows, at long intervals. He then applied his ear to the coal, cautioning the workers to be very silent. Not a sound reached him, and he shook his head. Evidently the poor lad was dreaming. In a fury, Zacharie struck in his turn, and listened anew with bright eyes, and limbs trembling with joy. Then the other workmen tried the experiment, one after the other, and all grew animated, hearing the distant reply quite clearly. The engineer was astonished. He again applied his ear, and was at last able to catch a sound of aerial softness, a rhythmical roll, scarcely to be distinguished. the well-known cadence beaten by the miners when they are fighting against the coal in the midst of danger. The coal transmits the sound with crystalline limpidity for a very great distance. A captain who was there estimated that the thickness of the block which separated them from their mates could not be less than 50 meters. But it seemed as if they could already stretch out a hand to them, and general gladness broke out. Négrel decided to begin at once the work of approach. When Zacharie, up above, saw Maheude again, they embraced each other. "It won't do to get excited," Pierron, who had come for a visit of inquisitiveness, was cruel enough to say. "If Catherine isn't there, it would be such a grief afterwards." That was true. Catherine might be somewhere else. "Just leave me alone, will you, damn it!" cried Zacharie in a rage. "She's there, I know it." Maheude sat down again in silence, with motionless face, continuing to wait. As soon as the story was spread at Montsou, a new crowd arrived. Nothing was to be seen, but they remained there all the same, and had to be kept at a distance. Down below, the work went on day and night. For fear of meeting an obstacle, the engineer had had 3 descending galleries opened in the seam, converging to the point where the enclosed miners were supposed to be. Only one pikeman could hew at the coal on the narrow face of the tube. He was relieved every 2 hours, and the coal piled in baskets was passed up, from hand to hand, by a chain of men, increased as the hole was hollowed out. The work at first proceeded very quickly. They did 6 meters a day. Zacharie had secured a place among the workers chosen for the hewing. It was a post of honour which was disputed over, and he became furious when they wished to relieve him after his regulation 2 hours of labour. He robbed his mates of their turn, and refused to let go the pick. His gallery was soon in advance of the others. He fought against the coal so fiercely that his breath could be heard coming from the tube like the roar of a forge within his breast. When he came out, black and muddy, dizzy with fatigue, he fell to the ground and had to be wrapped up in a covering. Then, still tottering, he plunged back again, and the struggle began anew. The low, deep blows, the stifled groans, the victorious fury of massacre. The worst was that the coal now became hard. He twice broke his tool, and was exasperated that he could not get on so fast. He suffered also from the heat, which increased with every metre of advance, and was unbearable at the end of this narrow hole where the air could not circulate. A hand ventilator worked well, but aeration was so inadequate that on 3 occasions it was necessary to take out fainting hewers who were being asphyxiated. Négrel lived below with his men. His meals were sent down to him, and he sometimes slept for a couple of hours on a truss of straw, rolled in a cloak. The one thing that kept them up was the supplication of the wretches beyond, the call which was sounded ever more distinctly to hasten on the rescue. It now rang very clearly with a musical sonority, as though struck on the plates of a harmonica. It led them on. They advanced to this crystalline sound as men advance to the sound of cannon in battle. Every time that a pikeman was relieved, Négrel went down and struck, then applied his ear, and every time, so far, the reply had come, rapid and urgent. He had no doubt remaining. They were advancing in the right direction, but with what fatal slowness! They would never arrive soon enough. On the first 2 days they had indeed hewn through 13 meters, but on the 3rd day they fell to 5, and then on the 4th to 3. The coal was becoming closer and harder, to such an extent that they now with difficulty struck through 2 meters. On the 9th day, after superhuman efforts, they had advanced 32 meters, and calculated that some 20 must still be left before them. For the prisoners it was the beginning of the 12th day. 12 times over had they passed 24 hours without bread, without fire, in that icy darkness. This awful idea moistened the eyelids and stiffened the arm of the workers. It seemed impossible that Christians could live longer. The distant blows had become weaker since the previous day, and every moment they trembled lest they should stop. Maheude came regularly every morning to sit at the mouth of the shaft. In her arms she brought Estelle, who could not remain alone from morning to night. Hour by hour she followed the workers, sharing their hopes and fears. There was feverish expectation among the groups standing around, and even as far as Montsou, with endless discussion. Every heart in the district was beating down there beneath the earth. On the ninth day, at the breakfast hour, no reply came from Zacharie when he was called for the relay. He was like a madman, working on furiously with oaths. Négrel, who had come up for a moment, was not there to make him obey, and only a captain and three miners were below. No doubt Zacharie, infuriated with the feeble, vacillating light which delayed his work, committed the imprudence of opening his lamp, although severe orders had been given, for leakages of fire damp had taken place, and the gas remained in enormous masses in these narrow, unventilated passages. Suddenly a roar of thunder was heard, and a spout of fire darted out of the tube as from the mouth of a cannon charged with grape shot. Everything flamed up and the air caught fire like powder, from one end of the galleries to the other. This torrent of flame carried away the captain and three workers, ascended the pit, and leapt up to the daylight in an eruption which split the rocks and the ruins around. The inquisitive fled, and Maheude arose, pressing the frightened Estelle to her breast. When Négrel and the men came back, they were seized by a terrible rage. They struck their heels on the earth as on a stepmother who was killing her children at random in the imbecile whims of her cruelty. They were devoting themselves, they were coming to the help of their mates, and still they must lose some of their men. After 3 long hours of effort and danger they reached the galleries once more, and the melancholy ascent of the victims took place. Neither the captain nor the workers were dead, but they were covered by awful wounds, which gave out an odour of grilled flesh. They had drunk of fire. The burns had got into their throats, and they constantly moaned and prayed to be finished off. One of the three miners was the man who had smashed the pump at Gaston Marie with a final blow of the shovel during the strike. The two others still had scars on their hands, and grazed, torn fingers from the energy with which they had thrown bricks at the soldiers. The pale and shuddering crowd took off their hats when they were carried by. Maheude stood waiting. Zacharie's body at last appeared. The clothes were burnt. The body was nothing but black charcoal, calcined and unrecognizable. The head had been smashed by the explosion and no longer existed. And when these awful remains were placed on a stretcher, Maheude followed them mechanically, her burning eyelids without a tear. With Estelle drowsily lying in her arms, she went along, a tragic figure, her hair lashed by the wind. At the settlement, Philomène seemed stupid, her eyes were turned into fountains, and she was quickly relieved. But the mother had already returned with the same step to Réquillart. She had accompanied her son, she was returning to wait for her daughter. 3 more days passed by. The rescue work had been resumed amid incredible difficulties. The galleries of approach had fortunately not fallen after the fire damp explosion, but the air was so heavy and so vitiated that more ventilators had to be installed. Every 20 minutes the pikemen relieved one another. They were advancing, scarcely 2 metres separated them from their mates. But now they worked, feeling cold at their hearts, striking hard only out of vengeance, for the noises had ceased, and the low, clear cadence of the call no longer sounded. It was the 12th day of their labours, the 15th since the catastrophe, and since the morning there had been a deathlike silence. The new accident increased the curiosity at Montsou, and the inhabitants organized excursions with such spirit that the Grégoires decided to follow the fashion. They arranged a party, and it was agreed that they should go to the Voreux in their carriage, while Madame Hennebeau took Lucie and Jeanne there in hers. Deneulin would show them over his yards, and then they would return to Réquillart, where Négrel would tell them the exact state of things in the galleries, and if there was still hope.
Finally, they would dine together in the evening. When the Grégoires and their daughter Cécile arrived at the ruined mine toward 3 o'clock, they found Madame Hennebeau already there, in a sea blue dress, protecting herself under her parasol from the pale February sun. The warmth of spring was in the clear sky. Monsieur Hennebeau was there with Deneulin, and she was listening, with listless ear, to the account which the latter gave of the efforts which had been made to dam up the canal. Jeanne, who always carried a sketch book with her, began to draw, carried away by the horror of the subject; while Lucie, seated beside her on the remains of a wagon, was crying out with pleasure, and finding it awfully jolly. The incomplete dam allowed numerous leaks, and frothy streams fell in a cascade down the enormous hole of the engulfed mine. The crater was being emptied, however, and the water, drunk by the earth, was sinking, and revealing the fearful ruin at the bottom. Beneath the tender azure of this beautiful day there lay a sewer, the ruins of a town drowned and melted in mud. "And people come out of their way to see that!" exclaimed Monsieur Grégoire, disillusioned. Cécile, rosy with health and glad to breathe so pure an air, was cheerfully joking, while Madame Hennebeau made a little grimace of repugnance as she murmured: "The fact is, this is not pretty at all." The two engineers laughed. They tried to interest the visitors, taking them round and explaining to them the working of the pumps, and the manipulation of the stamper which drove in the piles. But the ladies became anxious. They shuddered when they knew that the pumps would have to work for 6 or 7 years before the shaft was reconstructed and all the water exhausted from the mine. No, they would rather think of something else. This destruction was only good to give bad dreams. "Let us go," said Madame Hennebeau, turning towards her carriage. Lucie and Jeanne protested. What, so soon, and the drawing which was not finished! They wanted to remain. Their father would bring them to dinner in the evening. Monsieur Hennebeau alone took his place with his wife in the carriage, for he wished to question Négrel. "Very well, go on before," said Monsieur Grégoire. "We will follow you. We have a little visit of 5 minutes to make over there at the settlement. Go on, go on. We shall be at Réquillart as soon as you." He got up behind Madame Grégoire and Cécile, and while the other carriage went along by the canal, theirs gently ascended the slope. Their excursion was to be completed by a visit of charity. Zacharie's death had filled them with pity for this tragical Maheu family, about whom the whole country was talking. They had no pity for the father, that brigand, that slayer of soldiers, who had to be struck down like a wolf. But the mother touched them, that poor woman who had just lost her son after having lost her husband, and whose daughter was perhaps a corpse beneath the earth. To say nothing of an invalid grandfather, a child who was lame as the result of a landslip, and a little girl who died of starvation during the strike. So that, though this family had in part deserved its misfortunes by the detestable spirit it had shown, they had resolved to assert the breadth of their charity, their desire for forgetfulness and conciliation, by themselves bringing on alms. 2 parcels, carefully wrapped up, had been placed beneath a seat of the carriage. An old woman pointed out to the coachman Maheude's house, number 16, in the second block. But when the Grégoires alighted with the parcels, they knocked in vain. At last they struck their fists against the door. Still without reply, the house echoed mournfully, like a house emptied by grief, frozen and dark, long since abandoned. "There's no one there," said Cécile, disappointed. "What a nuisance! What shall we do with all this?" Suddenly the door of the next house opened, and the Levaque woman appeared. "Oh, sir, I beg pardon, ma'am. Excuse me, miss. It's the neighbour that you want. She's not there. She's at Réquillart." With a flow of words she told them the story, repeating to them that people must help one another, and that she was keeping Lénore and Henri in her house to allow the mother to go and wait over there. Her eyes had fallen on the parcels, and she began to talk about her poor daughter, who had become a widow, displaying her own wretchedness. while her eyes shone with covetousness. Then, in a hesitating way, she muttered: "I've got the key, if the lady and gentleman would really like." "The grandfather is there." The Grégoires looked at her in stupefaction. What! The grandfather was there? But no one had replied. He was sleeping, then? And when the Levaque made up her mind to open the door, what they saw stopped them on the threshold. Bonnemort was there alone, with large fixed eyes, nailed to his chair in front of the cold fireplace. Around him the room appeared larger without the clock or the polished deal furniture which formerly animated it. There only remained, against the green crudity of the walls, the portraits of the emperor and empress, whose rosy lips were smiling with official benevolence. The old man did not stir nor wink his eyelids beneath the sudden light from the door. He seemed imbecile, as though he had not seen all these people come in. At his feet lay his plate, garnished with ashes, such as is placed for cats for ordure. "Don't mind if he's not very polite," said the Levaque woman, obligingly. "Seems he's broken something in his brain. It's a fortnight since he left off speaking." But Bonnemort was shaken by some agitation, a deep scraping which seemed to arise from his belly, and he expectorated into the plate a thick black expectoration. The ashes were soaked into a coaly mud, all the coal of the mine which he drew from his chest. He had already resumed his immobility. He stirred no more, except at intervals to spit. Uneasy, and with stomachs turned, the Grégoires endeavoured to utter a few friendly and encouraging words. "Well, my good man," said the father, "you have a cold, then?" The old man, with his eyes to the wall, did not turn his head, and a heavy silence fell once more. "They ought to make you a little gruel," added the mother. He preserved his mute stiffness. "I say, papa," murmured Cécile, "they certainly told us he was an invalid, only we did not think of it afterwards." She interrupted herself, much embarrassed. After having placed on the table a pot au feu and two bottles of wine, she undid the second parcel and drew from it a pair of enormous boots. It was the present intended for the grandfather, and she held one boot in each hand, in confusion, contemplating the poor man's swollen feet, which would never walk again. "Eh! they come a little late, don't they, my worthy fellow?" said M. Grégoire again, to enliven the situation. "It doesn't matter, they're always useful." Bonnemort neither heard nor replied, with his terrible face as cold and as hard as a stone. Then Cécile furtively placed the boots against the wall. But in spite of her precautions, the nails clanked, and those enormous boots stood oppressively in the room. "He won't say thank you," said the Levaque woman, who had cast a look of deep envy on the boots. "Might as well give a pair of spectacles to a duck, asking your pardon." She went on. She was trying to draw the Grégoires into her own house, where she hoped to gain their pity. At last she thought of a pretext. She praised Henri and Lénore, who were so good, so gentle, and so intelligent, answering like angels the questions that they were asked. They would tell the lady and gentleman all that they wished to know. "Will you come for a moment, my child?" asked the father, glad to get away. "Yes, I'll follow you," she replied. Cécile remained alone with Bonnemort. What kept her there, trembling and fascinating, was the thought that she seemed to recognize this old man. Where, then, had she met this square, livid face, tattooed with coal? Suddenly she remembered. She saw again a mob of shouting people who surrounded her, and she felt cold hands pressing her neck. It was he. She saw the man again. She looked at his hands placed on his knees, the hands of an invalid workman whose whole strength is in his wrists, still firm in spite of age. Gradually Bonnemort seemed to awake. He perceived her and examined her in his turn. A flame mounted to his cheeks, a nervous spasm drew his mouth, from which flowed a thin streak of black saliva. Fascinated, they remained opposite each other, she flourishing, plump and fresh from the long idleness and sated comfort of her race, he, swollen with water, with the pitiful ugliness of a foundered beast, destroyed from father to son by a century of work and hunger. At the end of 10 minutes, when the Grégoires, surprised at not seeing Cécile, came back into the Maheus' house, they uttered a terrible cry. Their daughter was lying on the ground with livid face, strangled. At her neck fingers had left the red imprint of a giant's hand. Bonnemort, tottering on his dead legs, had fallen beside her without power to rise. His hands were still hooked, and he looked round with his imbecile air and large open eyes. In his fall he had broken his plate, the ashes were spread round, the mud of the black expectoration had stained the floor, while the great pair of boots, safe and sound, stood side by side against the wall. It was never possible to establish the exact facts. Why had Cécile come near? How could Bonnemort, nailed to his chair, have been able to seize her throat? Evidently when he held her he must have become furious, constantly pressing, overthrown with her, and stifling her cries to the last groan. Not a sound, not a moan had traversed the thin partition to the neighbouring house. It seemed to be an outbreak of sudden madness, a longing to murder before this white young neck. Such savagery was stupefying in an old invalid who had lived like a worthy man, an obedient brute, opposed to new ideas. What rancour, unknown to himself, by some slow process of poisoning, had risen from his bowels to his brain. The horror of it led to the conclusion that he was unconscious, that it was the crime of an idiot. The Grégoires, meanwhile, on their knees, were sobbing, choked with grief. Their idolized daughter, that daughter desired so long, on whom they had lavished all their goods, whom they used to watch sleeping, on tiptoe, whom they never thought sufficiently well nourished, never sufficiently plump. It was the downfall of their very life. What was the good of living, now that they would have to live without her? The Levaque woman in distraction cried: "Ah, the old beggar! What's he done there? Who would have expected such a thing? And Maheude, who won't come back till evening. Shall I go and fetch her?" The father and mother were crushed, and did not reply. It will be better. I'll go." But before going, the Levaque woman looked at the boots. The whole settlement was excited, and a crowd was already hustling round. Perhaps they would get stolen. And then the Maheus had no man, now, to put them on. She quietly carried them away. They would just fit Bouteloupe's feet. At Réquillart, the Hennebeaus, with Négrel, waited a long time for the Grégoires. Négrel, who had come up from the pit, gave details. They hoped to communicate that very evening with the prisoners, but they would certainly find nothing but corpses, for the death-like silence continued. Behind the engineer, Maheude, seated on the beam, was listening with white face, when the Levaque woman came up and told her the old man's strange deed. And she only made a sweeping gesture of impatience and irritation. She followed her, however. Madame Hennebeau was much affected. What an abomination! That poor Cécile, so merry that very day, so full of life an hour before. M. Hennebeau had to lead his wife for a moment into old Mouque's hovel. With his awkward hands he unfastened her dress, troubled by the odour of musk which her open bodice exhaled. And as with streaming tears she clasped Négrel, terrified at this death which cut short the marriage, the husband watched them lamenting together and was delivered from one anxiety. This misfortune would arrange everything. He preferred to keep his nephew for fear of his coachman. Section 39 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Part 7, Chapter 5.
At the bottom of the shaft the abandoned wretches were yelling with terror. The water now came up to their hips. The noise of the torrent dazed them. The final falling in of the tubbing sounded like the last crack of doom, and their bewilderment was completed by the neighing of the horses shut up in the stable, the terrible, unforgettable death cry of an animal that is being slaughtered. Mouque had let go Bataille. The old horse was there, trembling, with its dilated eye fixed on this water which was constantly rising. The pit eye was rapidly filling, the greenish flood slowly enlarged under the red gleam of the three lamps which were still burning under the roof. And suddenly, when he felt this ice soaking his coat, he set out in a furious gallop, and was engulfed and lost at the end of one of the haulage galleries. Then there was a general rush, the men following the beast. "Nothing more to be done in this damned hole!" shouted Mouque. "We must try Réquillart." The idea that they might get out by the old neighbouring pit, if they arrived before the passage was cut off, now carried them away. The 20 hustled one another as they went in single file, holding their lamps in the air so that the water should not extinguish them. Fortunately, the gallery rose with an imperceptible slope, and they proceeded for 200 metres, struggling against the flood, which was not now gaining on them. Sleeping beliefs reawakened in these distracted souls. They invoked the earth, for it was the earth that was avenging herself, discharging the blood from the vein because they had cut one of her arteries. An old man stammered forgotten prayers, bending his thumbs backwards to appease the evil spirits of the mine. But at the first turning disagreement broke out. The groom proposed turning to the left. Others declared that they could make a short cut by going to the right. A minute was lost. "Well, die there! What the devil does it matter to me?" Chaval brutally exclaimed. "I go this way." He turned to the right, and two mates followed him. The others continued to rush behind Father Mouque, who had grown up at the bottom of Réquillart. He himself hesitated, however, not knowing where to turn. They lost their heads. Even the old men could no longer recognize the passages, which lay like a tangled skein before them. At every bifurcation they were pulled up short by uncertainty, and yet they had to decide. Étienne was running at last, delayed by Catherine, who was paralyzed by fatigue and fear. He would have gone to the right with Chaval, for he thought that the better road, but he had not, preferring to part from Chaval. The rush continued, however. Some of the mates had gone from their side, and only 7 were left behind old Mouque. "Hang on to my neck, and I will carry you," said Étienne to the young girl, seeing her grow weak. "No, let me be," she murmured. "I can't do more. I would rather die at once." They delayed and were left 50 metres behind. He was lifting her, in spite of her resistance, when the gallery was suddenly stopped up. An enormous block fell in and separated them from the others. The inundation was already soaking the soil, which was shifting on every side. They had to retrace their steps. Then they no longer knew in what direction they were going. There was an end of all hope of escaping by Réquillart. Their only remaining hope was to gain the upper workings, from which they might perhaps be delivered if the water sank. Étienne at last recognized the Guillaume seam. "Good!" he exclaimed. "Now I know where we are. By God! we were in the right road, but we may go to the devil now. Here, let us go straight on. We will climb up the passage." The flood was beating against their breasts, and they walked very slowly. As long as they had light they did not despair, and they blew out one of the lamps to economize the oil, meaning to empty it into the other lamp. They had reached the chimney passage, when a noise behind made them turn. Was it some mates, then, who had also found the road barred and were returning? A roaring sound came from afar. They could not understand this tempest which approached them, spattering foam. And they cried out when they saw a gigantic whitish mass coming out of the shadow and trying to rejoin them between the narrow timbering in which it was being crushed. It was Bataille. On leaving the pit eye he had wildly galloped along the dark galleries. He seemed to know his road in this subterranean town, which he had inhabited for 11 years, and his eyes saw clearly in the depths of the eternal night in which he had lived. He galloped on, bending his head, drawing up his feet, passing through these narrow tubes in the earth, filled by his great body. Road succeeded to road, and the forked turnings were passed without any hesitation. Where was he going? Over there, perhaps, towards that vision of his youth, to the mill where he had been born, on the bank of the Scarpe, to the confused recollection of the sun burning in the air like a great lamp. He desired to live. His beast's memory awoke. The longing to breathe once more the air of the plains drove him straight onwards to the discovery of that hole, the exit beneath the warm sun into light. Rebellion carried away his ancient resignation. This pit was murdering him after having blinded him. The water which pursued him was lashing him on the flanks and biting him on the crupper. But as he went deeper in, the galleries became narrower, the roofs lower, and the walls protruded. He galloped on in spite of everything, grazing himself, leaving shreds of his limbs on the timber. From every side the mine seemed to be pressing on to him, to take him and to stifle him. Then Étienne and Catherine, as he came near them, perceived that he was strangling between the rocks. He had stumbled and broken his two front legs. With a last effort he dragged himself a few metres, but his flanks could not pass. He remained hemmed in and garrotted by the earth. With his bleeding head stretched out, he still sought for some crack with his great troubled eyes. The water was rapidly covering him. He began to neigh with that terrible prolonged death rattle with which the other horses had already died in the stable. It was a sight of fearful agony, this old beast shattered and motionless, struggling at this depth, far from the daylight. The flood was drowning his mane, and his cry of distress never ceased. He uttered it more hoarsely, with his large open mouth stretched out. There was a last rumble, the hollow sound of a cask which is being filled, then deep silence fell. "Oh, my God! Take me away!" Catherine sobbed. "Oh, my God! I'm afraid! I don't want to die! Take me away! Take me away!" She had seen death, the fallen shaft, the inundated mine. Nothing had seized her with such terror as this clamour of Bataille in agony. And she constantly heard it, her ears were ringing with it, all her flesh was shuddering with it. "Take me away! Take me away!" Étienne had seized her and lifted her. It was indeed time. They ascended the chimney passage, soaked to the shoulders. He was obliged to help her, for she had no strength to cling to the timber. 3 times over he thought that she was slipping from him, and falling back into that deep sea of which the tide was roaring beneath them. However, they were able to breathe for a few minutes when they reached the first gallery, which was still free. The water reappeared, and they had to hoist themselves up again, and for hours this ascent continued, the flood chasing them from passage to passage, and constantly forcing them to ascend. At the 6th level a respite rendered them feverish with hope, and it seemed that the waters were becoming stationary. But a more rapid rise took place, and they had to climb to the 7th and then to the 8th level. Only one remained, and when they had reached it they anxiously watched each centimetre by which the water gained on them. If it did not stop they would then die like the old horse, crushed against the roof, and their chests filled by the flood. Landslips echoed every moment. The whole mine was shaken, and its distended bowels burst with the enormous flood which gorged them. At the end of the galleries the air, driven back, pressed together and crushed, exploded terribly amid split rocks and overthrown soil. It was a terrifying uproar of interior cataclysms, a remnant of the ancient battle when deluges overthrew the earth, burying the mountains beneath the plains. And Catherine, shaken and dazed by this continuous downfall, joined her hands, stammering the same words without cessation.
I don't want to die! I don't want to die!" To reassure her, Étienne declared that the water was not now moving. Their flight had lasted for fully 6 hours, and they would soon be rescued. He said 6 hours without knowing, for they had lost all count of time. In reality a whole day had already passed in their climb up through the Guillaume seam. Drenched and shivering, they settled themselves down. She undressed herself without shame and wrung out her clothes. Then she put on again the jacket and breeches, and let them finish drying on her. As her feet were bare, he made her take his own sabots. They could wait patiently now. They had lowered the wick of the lamp, leaving only the feeble gleam of a night light. But their stomachs were torn by cramp, and they both realized that they were dying of hunger. Up till now they had not felt that they were living. The catastrophe had occurred before breakfast, and now they found their bread and butter swollen by the water and changed into sop. She had to become angry before he would accept his share. As soon as she had eaten she fell asleep from weariness on the cold earth. He was devoured by insomnia, and watched over her with fixed eyes and forehead between his hands. How many hours passed by thus, he would have been unable to say. All that he knew was that before him, through the hole they had ascended, he had seen the flood reappear, black and moving, the beast whose back ceaselessly swelling out to reach them. At first it was only a thin line, a supple serpent stretching itself out. Then it enlarged into a crawling, crouching flank, and soon it reached them, and the sleeping girl's feet were touched by it. In his anxiety he yet hesitated to wake her. Was it not cruel to snatch her from this repose of unconscious ignorance, which was, perhaps, lulling her with a dream of the open air and of life beneath the sun? Besides, where could they fly? And he thought and remembered that the upbrow established at this part of the seam communicated end to end with that which served the upper level. That would be a way out. He let her sleep as long as possible, watching the flood gain on them, waiting for it to chase them away. At last he lifted her gently, and a great shudder passed over her. "Ah, my God, it's true! It's beginning again! My God!" She remembered, she cried out, again finding death so near. "No, calm yourself," he whispered. "We can pass, upon my word." To reach the upbrow they had to walk doubled up, again wetted to the shoulders, and the climbing began anew, now more dangerous, through this hole entirely of timber, 100 metres long. At first they wished to pull the cable so as to fix one of the carts at the bottom, for if the other should come down during their ascent they would be crushed. But nothing moved, some obstacle interfered with the mechanism. They ventured in, not daring to make use of the cable, which was in their way, and tearing their nails against the smooth framework. He came behind, supporting her by his head when she slipped with torn hands. Suddenly they came across the splinters of a beam which barred the way. A portion of the soil had fallen down and prevented them from going any higher. Fortunately a door opened here, and they passed into a passage. They were stupefied to see the flicker of a lamp in front of them. A man cried wildly to them: "More clever people as big fools as I am." They recognized Chaval, who had found himself blocked by the landslip which filled the upbrow. His two mates, who had set out with him, had been left on the way with fractured skulls. He was wounded in the elbow, but had had the courage to go back on his knees, take their lamps, and search them to steal their bread and butter. As he escaped, a final downfall behind his back had closed the gallery. He immediately swore that he would not share his victuals with these people who came up out of the earth. He would sooner knock their brains out. Then he, too, recognized them. His anger fell, and he began to laugh with the laugh of evil joy. "Ah, it's you, Catherine! You've broken your nose, and you want to join your man again. Well, well, we'll play out the game together." He pretended not to see Étienne. The latter, overwhelmed by this encounter,
made a gesture as though to protect the putter, who was pressing herself against him. He must, however, accept the situation. Speaking as though they had left each other good friends an hour before, he simply asked: "Have you looked down below? We can't pass through the cuttings then." Chaval still grinned. "Ah, bosh! The cuttings! They've fallen in too. We are between two walls, a real mouse trap. But you can go back by the brow if you are a good diver." The water, in fact, was rising. They could hear it rippling. Their retreat was already cut off. And he was right, it was a mouse trap, a gallery end obstructed before and behind by considerable falls of earth. There was not one issue, all three were walled up. "Then you'll stay?" Chaval added jeeringly. "Well, it's the best you can do. And if you'll just leave me alone, I shan't even speak to you. There's still room here for two men. We shall soon see which will die first, provided they don't come to us, which seems a tough job." The young man said: "If we were to hammer, they would hear us perhaps." "I'm tired of hammering. Here, try yourself with this stone." Étienne picked up the fragment of sandstone which the other had already broken off, and against the seam at the end he struck the miner's call, the prolonged roll by which workmen in peril signal their presence. Then he placed his ear to listen. 20 times over he persisted. No sound replied. During this time Chaval affected to be coolly attending to his little household. First he arranged the 3 lamps against the wall. Only one was burning, the others could be used later on. Afterwards he placed on a piece of timber the 2 slices of bread and butter which were still left. That was the sideboard. He could last quite 2 days with that, if he were careful. He turned round, saying: "You know, Catherine, there will be half for you when you are famished." The young girl was silent. It completed her unhappiness to find herself again between these 2 men. And their awful life began. Neither Chaval nor Étienne opened their mouths, seated on the earth a few paces from each other. At a hint from the former, the latter extinguished his lamp, a piece of useless luxury. Then they sank back into silence. Catherine was lying down near Étienne, restless under the glances of her former lover. The hours passed by. They heard the low murmur of the water for ever rising, while from time to time deep shocks and distant echoes announced the final settling down of the mine. When the lamp was empty and they had to open another to light it, they were, for a moment, disturbed by the fear of fire damp. But they would rather have been blown up at once than live on in darkness. Nothing exploded, however, there was no fire damp. They stretched themselves out again, and the hours continued to pass by. A noise aroused Étienne and Catherine, and they raised their heads. Chaval had decided to eat. He had cut off half a slice of bread and butter, and was chewing it slowly, to avoid the temptation of swallowing it all. They gazed at him, tortured by hunger. "Well, do you refuse?" he said to the putter, in his provoking way. "You're wrong." She had lowered her eyes, fearing to yield. Her stomach was torn by such cramps that tears were swelling beneath her eyelids. But she understood what he was asking. In the morning he had breathed over her neck. He was seized again by one of his old furies of desire on seeing her near the other man. The glances with which he called her had a flame in them which she knew well, the flame of his crises of jealousy, when he would fall on her with his fists, accusing her of committing abominations with her mother's lodger. And she was not willing. She trembled lest, by returning to him, she should throw these 2 men on to each other in this narrow cave, where they were all in agony together. Good God! Why could they not end together in comradeship? Étienne would have died of inanition rather than beg a mouthful of bread from Chaval. The silence became heavy, an eternity seemed to be prolonging itself with the slowness of monotonous minutes which passed by, one by one, without hope. They had now been shut up together for a day. The second lamp was growing pale, and they lighted the third. Chaval started on his second slice of bread and butter, and growled: "Come then, stupid!" Catherine shivered. Étienne had turned away in order to leave her free. Then, as she did not stir, he said to her, in a low voice: "Go, my child." The tears, which she was stifling, then rushed forth. She wept for a long time, without even strength to rise, no longer knowing if she was hungry, suffering with pain which she felt all over her body. He was standing up, going backward and forwards, vainly beating the miner's call, enraged at this remainder of life which he was obliged to live here, tied to a rival whom he detested. Not even enough space to die away from each other. As soon as he had gone 10 paces he must come back and knock up against this man. And she, this sorrowful girl whom they were disputing over even in the earth, she would belong to the one who lived longest. That man would steal her from him should he go first. There was no end to it. The hours followed the hours. The revolting promiscuity became worse, with the poison of their breaths and the odour of their necessities satisfied in common. Twice he rushed against the rocks as though to open them with his fists. Another day was done, and Chaval had seated himself near Catherine, sharing with her his last half slice. She was chewing the mouthfuls painfully. He made her pay for each with a caress, in his jealous obstinacy not willing to die until he had had her again in the other man's presence. She abandoned herself in exhaustion. But when he tried to take her, she complained: "Oh, leave me! You're breaking my bones." Étienne, with a shudder, had placed his forehead against the timber so as not to see. He came back with a wild leap. "Leave her, by God!" "Does it concern you?" said Chaval. "She's my woman. I suppose she belongs to me." And he took her again and pressed her, out of bravado, crushing his red moustache against her mouth, and continuing: "Will you leave us alone, eh? Will you be good enough to look over there if we are at it?" But Étienne, with white lips, shouted: "If you don't let her go, I'll do for you." The other quickly stood up, for he had understood by the hiss of the voice that his mate was in earnest. Death seemed to them too slow. It was necessary that one of them should immediately yield his place. It was the old battle beginning over again, down in the earth where they would soon sleep side by side. And they had so little room that they could not swing their fists without grazing them. "Look out!" growled Chaval. "This time I'll have you." From that moment Étienne became mad. His eyes seemed drowned in red vapour, his chest was congested by the flow of blood. The need to kill seized him irresistibly, a physical need like the irritation of mucus which causes a violent spasm of coughing. It rose and broke out beyond his will, beneath the pressure of the hereditary disease. He had seized a sheet of slate in the wall, and he shook it and tore it out, a very large, heavy piece. Then with both hands and with tenfold strength he brought it down on Chaval's skull. The latter had not time to jump backwards. He fell, his face crushed, his skull broken. The brains had bespattered the roof of the gallery, and a purple jet flowed from the wound, like the continuous jet of a spring. Immediately there was a pool which reflected the smoky star of the lamp. Darkness was invading the walled up cave, and this body, lying on the earth, looked like the black boss of a mass of rough coal. Leaning over, with wide eyes, Étienne looked at him. It was done then. He had killed. All his struggles came back to his memory confusedly. That useless fight against the poison which slept in his muscles, the slowly accumulated alcohol of his race. He was, however, only intoxicated by hunger. The remote intoxication of his parents had been enough. His hair stood up before the horror of this murder. And yet, in spite of the revolt which came from his education, a certain gladness made his heart beat, the animal joy of an appetite at length satisfied. He felt pride, too, the pride of the stronger man. The little soldier appeared before him, with his throat opened by a knife, killed by a child. Now he, too, had killed. But Catherine, standing erect, uttered a loud cry. "My God! He is dead!" "Are you sorry?" asked Étienne, fiercely. She was choking, she stammered; then, tottering, she threw herself into his arms. "Ah, kill me too! Ah, let us both die!" She clasped him, hanging to his shoulders, and he clasped her, and they hoped that they would die. But death was in no hurry, and they unlocked their arms. Then, while she hid her eyes, he dragged away the wretch, and threw him down the upbrow, to remove him from the narrow space in which they still had to live. Life would no longer have been possible with that corpse beneath their feet. And they were terrified when they heard it plunge into the midst of the foam which leapt up. The water had already filled that hole then? They saw it, it was entering the gallery. Then there was a new struggle. They had lighted the last lamp. It was becoming exhausted in illuminating this flood, with its regular, obstinate rise which never ceased. At first the water came up to their ankles, then it wetted their knees. The passage sloped up, and they took refuge at the end. This gave them a respite for some hours. But the flood caught them up, and bathed them to the waist. Standing up, brought to bay, with their spines close against the rock, they watched it ever and ever increasing. When it reached their mouths, all would be over. The lamp, which they had fastened up, threw a yellow light on the rapid surge of the little waves. It was becoming pale; they could distinguish no more than a constantly diminishing semicircle, as though eaten away by the darkness which seemed to grow with the flood. And suddenly the darkness enveloped them. The lamp had gone out, after having spat forth its last drop of oil. There was now complete and absolute night, that night of the earth which they would have to sleep through without ever again opening their eyes to the brightness of the sun. "By God!" Étienne swore in a low voice. Catherine, as though she had felt the darkness seize her, sheltered herself against him. She repeated, in a whisper, the miner's saying: "Death is blowing out the lamp." Yet, in the face of this threat, their instincts struggled. The fever for life animated them. He violently set himself to hollow out the slate with the hook of the lamp, while she helped him with her nails. They formed a sort of elevated bench, and when they had both hoisted themselves up to it, they found themselves seated with hanging legs and bent backs, for the vault forced them to lower their heads. They now only felt the icy water at their heels, but before long the cold was at their ankles, their calves, their knees, with its invincible, truceless movement. The bench, not properly smoothed, was soaked in moisture, and so slippery that they had to hold themselves on vigorously to avoid slipping off. It was the end. What could they expect, reduced to this niche where they dared not move, exhausted, starving, having neither bread nor light? And they suffered especially from the darkness, which would not allow them to see the coming of death. There was deep silence. The mine, being gorged with water, no longer stirred. They had nothing beneath them now but the sensation of that sea, swelling out its silent tide from the depths of the galleries. The hours succeeded one another, all equally black, but they were not able to measure their exact duration, becoming more and more vague in their calculation of time. Their tortures, which might have been expected to lengthen the minutes, rapidly bore them away. They thought that they had only been shut up for 2 days and a night, when in reality the third day had already come to an end. All hope of help had gone. No one knew they were there. No one could come down to them. And hunger would finish them off if the inundation spared them. For one last time it occurred to them to beat the call, but the stone was lying beneath the water. Besides, who would hear them? Catherine was leaning her aching head against the seam, when she sat up with a start. "Listen," she said. At first Étienne thought she was speaking of the low noise of the ever rising water. He lied in order to quiet her. "It's me you hear. I'm moving my legs." "No, no, not that. Over there. Listen."
and she placed her ear to the coal. He understood, and did likewise. They waited for some seconds, with stifled breath. Then, very far away and very weak, they heard three blows at long intervals. But they still doubted, their ears were ringing. Perhaps it was the cracking of the soil, and they knew not what to strike with in answer. Étienne had an idea. "You have the sabots; take them off and strike with the heels." She struck, beating the miner's call, and they listened, and again distinguished the three blows far off. 20 times over they did it, and 20 times the blows replied. They wept and embraced each other, at the risk of losing their balance. At last the mates were there, they were coming. An overflowing joy and love carried away the torments of expectation and the rage of their vain appeals, as though their rescuers had only to split the rock with a finger to deliver them. "Eh!" she cried merrily, "wasn't it lucky that I lent my head?" "Oh, you've got an ear," he said in his turn. "Now I heard nothing." From that moment they relieved each other, one of them always listening, ready to answer at the least signal. They soon caught the sounds of the pick; the work of approaching them was beginning. A gallery was being opened. Not a sound escaped them, but their joy sank. In vain they laughed to deceive each other; despair was gradually seizing them. At first they entered into long explanations. Evidently they were being approached from Réquillart. The gallery descended in the bed. Perhaps several were being opened, for there were always three men hewing. Then they talked less, and were at last silent when they came to calculate the enormous mass which separated them from their mates. They continued their reflections in silence, counting the days and days that a workman would take to penetrate such a block. They would never be reached soon enough; they would have time to die 20 times over. And no longer venturing to exchange a word in this redoubled anguish, they gloomily replied to the appeals by a roll of the sabots, without hope, only retaining the mechanical need to tell the others that they were still alive. Thus passed a day, 2 days. They had been at the bottom 6 days. The water had stopped at their knees, neither rising nor falling, and their legs seemed to be melting away in this icy bath. They could certainly keep them out for an hour or so, but their position then became so uncomfortable that they were twisted by horrible cramps, and were obliged to let their feet fall in again. Every 10 minutes they hoisted themselves back by a jerk on the slippery rock. The fractures of the coal struck into their spines, and they felt at the back of their necks a fixed, intense pain, through having to keep constantly bent in order to avoid striking their heads. And their suffocation increased. The air, driven back by the water, was compressed into a sort of bell in which they were shut up. Their voices were muffled, and seemed to come from afar. Their ears began to buzz; they heard the peals of a furious tocsin, the tramp of a flock beneath a storm of hail, going on unceasingly. At first Catherine suffered horribly from hunger. She pressed her poor shrivelled hands against her breasts. Her breathing was deep and hollow, a continuous tearing moan, as though tongs were tearing her stomach. Étienne, choked by the same torture, was feeling feverishly round him in the darkness, when his nails came upon a half rotten piece of timber, which his nails could crumble. He gave a handful of it to the putter, who swallowed it greedily. For 2 days they lived on this worm eaten wood, devouring it all in despair when it was finished, grazing their hands in the effort to crush the other planks, which were still solid with resisting fibres. Their torture increased, and they were enraged that they could not chew the cloth of their clothes. A leather belt, which he wore round the waist, relieved them a little. He bit small pieces from it with his teeth, and she chewed them and endeavoured to swallow them. This occupied their jaws, and gave them the illusion of eating. Then, when the belt was finished, they went back to their clothes, sucking them for hours. But soon these violent crises subsided. Hunger became only a low deep ache with the slow progressive languor of their strength. No doubt they would have succumbed if they had not had as much water as they desired. They merely bent down and drank from the hollow of the hand, and that very frequently, parched by a thirst which all this water could not quench. On the seventh day Catherine was bending down to drink, when her hand struck some floating body before her. "I say, look! What's this?" Étienne felt in the darkness. "I can't make out. It seems like the cover of a ventilation door." She drank, but as she was drawing up a second mouthful the body came back, striking her hand, and she uttered a terrible cry. "My God! It's he!" "Whom do you mean?" "Him. You know well enough. I felt his moustache." It was Chaval's corpse, risen from the upbrow and pushed on to them by the flow. Étienne stretched out his arm. He, too, felt the moustache and the crushed nose, and shuddered with disgust and fear. Seized by horrible nausea, Catherine had spat out the water which was still in her mouth. It seemed to her that she had been drinking blood, and that all the deep water before her was now that man's blood. "Wait," stammered Étienne, "I'll push him off." He kicked the corpse, which moved off, but soon they felt it again striking against their legs. "By God! Get off!" And the third time Étienne had to leave it. Some current always brought it back. Chaval would not go. He desired to be with them, against them. It was an awful companion, at last poisoning the air. All that day they never drank, struggling, preferring to die. It was not until the next day that their suffering decided them. They pushed away the body at each mouthful and drank in spite of it. It had not been worth while to knock his brains out, for he came back between him and her, obstinate in his jealousy. To the very end he would be there, even though he was dead, preventing them from coming together. A day passed, and again another day. At every shiver of the water, Étienne perceived a slight blow from the man he had killed, the simple elbowing of a neighbour who was reminding you of his presence. And every time it came he shuddered. He continually saw it there, swollen, greenish, with the red moustache and the crushed face. Then he no longer remembered. He had not killed him. The other man was swimming and trying to bite him. Catherine was now shaken by long, endless fits of crying, after which she was completely prostrated. She fell at last into a condition of irresistible drowsiness. He would arouse her, but she stammered a few words and at once fell asleep again without even raising her eyelids. And fearing lest she should be drowned, he put his arm round her waist. It was he now who replied to the mates. The blows of the pick were now approaching, he could hear them behind his back. But his strength, too, was diminishing. He had lost all courage to strike. They were known to be there. Why weary oneself more? It no longer interested him whether they came or not. In the stupefaction of waiting, he would forget for hours at a time what he was waiting for. One relief comforted them a little. The water sank, and Chaval's body moved off. For 9 days the work of their deliverance had been going on, and they were for the first time taking a few steps in the gallery when a fearful commotion threw them to the ground. They felt for each other and remained in each other's arms like mad people, not understanding, thinking the catastrophe was beginning over again. Nothing more stirred. The sounds of the picks had ceased. In the corner where they were seated, holding each other, side by side, a low laugh came from Catherine. "It must be good outside. Come, let's go out of here." Étienne at first struggled against this madness, but the contagion was shaking his stronger head, and he lost the exact sensation of reality. All their senses seemed to go astray, especially Catherine's. She was shaken by fever, tormented now by the need to talk and move. The ringing in her ears had become the murmur of flowing water, the song of birds. She smelled the strong odour of crushed grass, and could see clearly great yellow patches floating before her eyes, so large that she thought she was out of doors, near the canal, in the meadows, on a fine summer day. "Eh, how warm it is! Take me then. Let us keep together. Oh, always, always!" He pressed her, and she rubbed herself against him for a long time, continuing to chatter like a happy girl. How silly we have been to wait so long! I would have liked you at once, and you did not understand. You sulked. Then, do you remember, at our house at night, when we could not sleep, with our faces out listening to each other's breathing, with such a longing to come together?" He was won by her gaiety, and joked over the recollection of her silent tenderness. "You struck me once. Yes, yes, blows on both cheeks." "It was because I loved you," she murmured. "You see, I prevented myself from thinking of you. I said to myself that it was quite done with, and all the time I knew that one day or another we should get together. It only wanted an opportunity, some lucky chance. Wasn't it so?" A shudder froze him. He tried to shake off this dream. Then he repeated slowly: "Nothing is ever done with. A little happiness is enough to make everything begin again." "Then you'll keep me, and it will be all right this time?" And she slipped down, fainting. She was so weak that her low voice died out. In terror he kept her against his heart. "Are you in pain?" She sat up, surprised. "No, not at all. Why?" But this question aroused her from her dream. She gazed at the darkness with distraction, wringing her hands in another fit of sobbing. My God, how black it is!" It was no longer the meadows, the odor of the grass, the song of larks, the great yellow sun. It was the fallen, inundated mine, the stinking gloom, the melancholy dripping of this cellar where they had been groaning for so many days. Her perverted senses now increased the horror of it. Her childish superstitions came back to her. She saw the black man, the old dead miner who returns to the pit to twist naughty girls' necks. "Listen! Did you hear?" "No, nothing. I heard nothing." "Yes, the man, you know. Look, he is there. The earth has let all the blood out of the vein to revenge itself for being cut into. And he is there. You can see him. Look, blacker than night. Oh, I'm so afraid! I'm so afraid!" She became silent, shivering. Then, in a very low voice, she whispered: "No, it's always the other one." "What other one?" "Him who is with us, who is not alive." The image of Chaval haunted her. She talked of him confusedly. She described the dog's life she led with him, the only day when he had been kind to her at Jean Bart, the other days of follies and blows, when he would kill her with caresses after having covered her with kicks. "I tell you that he's coming, that he will still keep us from being together. His jealousy is coming on him again. Oh, push him off! Oh, keep me close!" With a sudden impulse she hung on to him, seeking his mouth and pressing her own passionately to it. The darkness lighted up. She saw the sun again, and she laughed a quiet laugh of love. He shuddered to feel her thus against his flesh, half naked beneath the tattered jacket and trousers, and he seized her with a reawakening of his virility. It was at length their wedding night, at the bottom of this tomb, on this bed of mud. The longing not to die before they had had their happiness, the obstinate longing to live and make life one last time. They loved each other in despair of everything, in death. After that there was nothing more. Étienne was seated on the ground, always in the same corner, and Catherine was lying motionless on his knees. Hours and hours passed by. For a long time he thought she was sleeping. Then he touched her. She was very cold. She was dead. He did not move, however, for fear of arousing her. The idea that he was the first who had possessed her as a woman, and that she might be pregnant, filled him with tenderness. Other ideas, the desire to go away with her, joy at what they would both do later on, came to him at moments, but so vaguely that it seemed only as though his forehead had been touched by a breath of sleep. He grew weaker. He only had strength to make a little gesture, a slow movement of the hand.
to assure himself that she was certainly there, like a sleeping child in her frozen stiffness. Everything was being annihilated, the night itself had disappeared, and he was nowhere, out of space, out of time. Something was certainly striking beside his head, violent blows were approaching him, but he had been too lazy to reply, benumbed by immense fatigue. And now he knew nothing. He only dreamed that she was walking before him, and that he heard the slight clank of her sabots. 2 days passed. She had not stirred. He touched her with his mechanical gesture, reassured to find her so quiet. Étienne felt a shock. Voices were sounding, rocks were rolling to his feet. When he perceived a lamp, he wept. His blinking eyes followed the light. He was never tired of looking at it, enraptured by this reddish point which scarcely stained the darkness. But some mates carried him away, and he allowed them to introduce some spoonfuls of soup between his clenched teeth. It was only in the Réquillart gallery that he recognized someone standing before him, the engineer Négrel, and these two men, with their contempt for each other, the rebellious workman and the sceptical master, threw themselves on each other's necks, sobbing loudly in the deep upheaval of all the humanity within them. It was an immense sadness, the misery of generations, the extremity of grief into which life can fall. At the surface, Maheude, stricken down near dead Catherine, uttered a cry, then another, then another. Very long, deep, incessant moans. Several corpses had already been brought up, and placed in a row on the ground. Chaval, who was thought to have been crushed beneath a landslip, a trammer, and two hewers, also crushed, with brainless skulls and bellies swollen with water. Women in the crowd went out of their minds, tearing their skirts and scratching their faces. When Étienne was at last taken out, after having been accustomed to the lamps and fed a little, he appeared fleshless, and his hair was quite white. People turned away and shuddered at this old man. Maheude left off crying to stare at him stupidly with her large, fixed eyes. Section 39. Section 40 of Germinal by Emile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Part 7. Chapter 6. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, and the fresh April night was growing warm at the approach of day. In the limpid sky the stars were twinkling out, while the east grew purple with dawn, and a slight shudder passed over the drowsy black country, the vague rumour which precedes awakening. Étienne, with long strides, was following the Vandame road. He had just passed 6 weeks at Montsou, in bed at the hospital. Though very thin and yellow, he felt strength to go, and he went. The Company, still trembling for its pits, was constantly sending men away, and had given him notice that he could not be kept on. He was offered the sum of 100 francs, with the paternal advice to leave off working in mines, as it would now be too severe for him. But he refused the 100 francs. He had already received a letter from Pluchart, calling him to Paris and enclosing money for the journey. His old dream would be realized. The night before, on leaving the hospital, he had slept at the Bon Joyeux, widow Désir's. As he rose early, only one desire was left, to bid his mates farewell before taking the 8 o'clock train at Marchiennes. For a moment Étienne stopped on the road, which was now becoming rose-coloured. It was good to breathe that pure air of the precocious spring. It would turn out a superb day. The sun was slowly rising, and the life of the earth was rising with it. And he set out walking again, vigorously striking with his briar stick, watching the plain afar, as it rose from the vapours of the night. He had seen no one. Maheude had come once to the hospital, and probably had not been able to come again. But he knew that the whole settlement of the 200 Quarants
was now going down to Jean Bart, and that she too had taken work there. Little by little the deserted roads were peopled, and colliers constantly passed Étienne with pallid, silent faces. The Company, people said, was abusing its victory. After 2½ months of strike, when they had returned to the pits, conquered by hunger, they had been obliged to accept the timbering tariff, that disguised decrease in wages, now the more hateful because stained with the blood of their mates. They were being robbed of an hour's work, they were being made false to their oath never to submit, and this imposed perjury stuck in their throats like gall. Work was beginning again everywhere, at Mirou, at Madeleine, at Crévecoeur, at the Victoire, everywhere, in the morning haze, along the roads lost in darkness, the flock was tramping on, rows of men, trotting with faces bent towards the earth, like cattle led to the slaughter‐house. They shivered beneath their thin garments, folding their arms, rolling their hips, expanding their backs with the humps formed by the brick between the shirt and the jacket. And in this wholesale return to work, in these mute shadows, all black, without a laugh, without a look aside, one felt the teeth clenched with rage, the hearts swollen with hatred, a simple resignation to the necessity of the belly. The nearer Étienne approached the pit, the more their number increased. They nearly all walked alone. Those who came in groups were in single file, already exhausted, tired of one another and of themselves. He noticed one who was very old, with eyes that shone like hot coals beneath his livid forehead. Another, a young man, was panting with the restrained fury of a storm. Many had their sabots in their hands. One could scarcely hear the soft sound of their coarse woollen stockings on the ground. It was an endless rustling, a general downfall, the forced march of a beaten army, moving on with lowered heads, sullenly absorbed in the desire to renew the struggle and achieve revenge. When Étienne arrived, Jean Bart was emerging from the shade. The lanterns, hooked on to the platform, were still burning in the growing dawn. Above the obscure buildings a trail of steam arose like a white plume delicately tinted with carmine. He passed up the sifting staircase to go to the receiving room. The descent was beginning, and the men were coming from the shed. For a moment he stood by, motionless, amid the noise and movement. The rolling of the trams shook the metal floor. The drums were turning, unrolling the cables in the midst of cries from the trumpet, the ringing of bells, blows of the mallet on the signal block. He found the monster again swallowing his daily ration of human flesh. The cages rising and plunging, engulfing their burden of men, without ceasing, with the facile gulp of a voracious giant. Since his accident he had a nervous horror of the mine. The cages, as they sank down, tore his bowels. He had to turn away his head. The pit exasperated him. But in the vast and still sombre hall, feebly lighted up by the exhausted lanterns, he could perceive no friendly face. The miners, who were waiting there with bare feet and their lamps in their hands, looked at him with large, restless eyes, and then lowered their faces, drawing back with an air of shame. No doubt they knew him, and no longer had any spite against him. They seemed, on the contrary, to fear him, blushing at the thought that he would reproach them with cowardice. This attitude made his heart swell. He forgot that these wretches had stoned him. He again began to dream of changing them into heroes, of directing a whole people, this force of nature which was devouring itself. The cage was embarking its men, and the batch disappeared. As others arrived he saw at last one of his lieutenants in the strike, a worthy fellow who had sworn to die. "You too?" he murmured, with aching heart. The other turned pale and his lips trembled. Then, with a movement of excuse: "What would you have? I've got a wife." Now in the new crowd coming from the shed he recognized them all. "You too! You too! You too!" And all shrank back, stammering in choked voices: "I have a mother! I have children! One must get bread!" The cage did not reappear. They waited for it mournfully, with such sorrow at their defeat that they avoided meeting each other's eyes, obstinately gazing at the shaft. "And Maheude?" Étienne asked. They made no reply. One made a sign that she was coming. Others raised their arms, trembling with pity. Ah, poor woman, what wretchedness! The silence continued, and then Étienne stretched out his hand to bid them farewell. They all pressed it vigorously, putting into that mute squeeze their rage at having yielded, their feverish hope of revenge. The cage was there, they got into it and sank, devoured by the gulf. Pierron had appeared with his naked captain's lamp fixed into the leather of his cap. For the past week he had been chief of the gang at the pit eye, and the men moved away, for promotion had rendered him bossy. The sight of Étienne annoyed him. He came up, however, and was at last reassured when the young man announced his departure. They talked. His wife now kept the Estaminet du Progrès, thanks to the support of all those gentlemen who had been so good to her. But he interrupted himself and turned furiously on to Father Mouque, whom he accused of not sending up the dung heap from his stable at the regulation hour. The old man listened with bent shoulders. Then, before going down, suffering from this reprimand, he, too, gave his hand to Étienne, with the same long pressure as the others, warm with restrained anger, and quivering with future rebellion. And this old hand which trembled in his, this old man who was forgiving him for the loss of his dead children, affected Étienne to such a degree that he watched him disappear without saying a word. "Then Maheude is not coming this morning?" he asked Pierron after a time. At first the latter pretended not to understand, for there was ill luck even in speaking of her. Then, as he moved away, under the pretext of giving an order, he said at last: "Eh, Maheude? There she is." In fact, Maheude had reached the shed with her lamp in her hand, dressed in trousers and jacket, with her head confined in the cap. It was by a charitable exception that the Company, pitying the fate of this unhappy woman, so cruelly afflicted, had allowed her to go down again at the age of 40; and as it seemed difficult to set her again at haulage work, she was employed to manipulate a small ventilator which had been installed in the north gallery, in those infernal regions beneath Tartaret, where there was no movement of air. For 10 hours, with aching back, she turned her wheel at the bottom of a burning tube, baked by 40 degrees of heat. She earned 30 sous. When Étienne saw her, a pitiful sight in her male garments, her breast and belly seeming to be swollen by the dampness of the cuttings, he stammered with surprise, trying to find words to explain that he was going away and that he wished to say good bye to her. She looked at him without listening, and said at last, speaking familiarly: "Eh, it surprises you to see me. It's true enough that I threatened to wring the neck of the first of my children who went down again. And now that I'm going down I ought to wring my own, ought I not? Ah, well! I should have done it by now if it hadn't been for the old man and the little ones at the house." And she went on in her low, fatigued voice. She did not excuse herself, she simply narrated things: that they had been nearly starved, and that she had made up her mind to it, so that they might not be sent away from the settlement. "How is the old man?" asked Étienne. "He is always very gentle and very clean. But he is quite off his nut. He was not brought up for that affair, you know. There was talk of shutting him up with a madman, but I was not willing. They would have done for him in his soup. His story has, all the same, been very bad for us, for he'll never get his pension. One of those gentlemen told me that it would be immoral to give him one." "Is Jeanlin working?" "Yes, those gentlemen found something for him to do at the top. He gets 20 sous. Oh, I don't complain. The bosses have been very good, as they told me themselves. The brat's 20 sous and my 30, that makes 50. If there were not 6 of us we should get enough to eat. Estelle devours now. And the worst is that it will be 4 or 5 years before Lénore and Henri are old enough to come to the pit." Étienne could not restrain a movement of pain. They too? Maheude's pale cheeks turned red, and her eyes flamed, but her shoulders sank as if beneath the weight of destiny. "What would you have? They after the others. They have all been done for there. Now it's their turn." She was silent. Some landers, who were rolling trams, disturbed them. Through the large dusty windows the early sun was entering, drowning the lanterns in grey light. And the engine moved every 3 minutes, the cables unrolled, the cages continued to swallow down men. "Come along, you loungers! Look sharp!" shouted Pierron. "Get in! We shall never have done with it today." Maheude, whom he was looking at, did not stir. She had already allowed 3 cages to pass. And she said, as though arousing herself and remembering Étienne's first words: "Then you're going away?" "Yes, this morning." "You're right. Better be somewhere else if one can. And I'm glad to have seen you, because you can now know, anyhow, that I've nothing on my mind against you. For a moment I could have killed you, after all that slaughter. But one thinks, doesn't one? One sees that when all's reckoned up, it's nobody's fault. No, no, it's not your fault, it's the fault of everybody." Now she talked with tranquillity of her dead, of her man, of Zacharie, of Catherine, and tears only came into her eyes when she uttered Alzire's name. She had resumed her calm reasonableness, and judged things sensibly. It would bring no luck to the middle class to have killed so many poor people. Sure enough, they would be punished for it, one day, for everything has to be paid for. There would even be no need to interfere. The whole thing would explode by itself. The soldiers would fire on the masters just as they had fired on the men. And in her everlasting resignation, in that hereditary discipline under which she was again bowing, a conviction had established itself, the certainty that injustice could not last longer, and that, if there were no good God left, another would spring up to avenge the wretched. She spoke in a low voice, with suspicious glances round. Then, as Pierron was coming up, she added aloud: "Well, if you're going, you must take your things from our house. There are still 2 shirts, 3 handkerchiefs, and an old pair of trousers." Étienne, with a gesture, refused these few things, save from the dealers. "No, it's not worth while. They can be for the children. At Paris I can arrange for myself." 2 more cages had gone down, and Pierron decided to speak straight to Maheude. "I say now, over there, they are waiting for you. Is that little chat nearly done?" But she turned her back. Why should he be so zealous, this man who had sold himself? The descent didn't concern him. His men hated him enough already on his level. And she persisted, with her lamp in her hand, frozen amid the drops in spite of the mildness of the season. Neither Étienne nor she found anything more to say. They remained facing each other with hearts so full that they would have liked to speak once more. At last she spoke for the sake of speaking. "De Levaque is in the family way. Levaque is still in prison. Bouteloup is taking his place meanwhile." "Ah, yes, Bouteloup. And listen, did I tell you? Philoméne has gone away." "What? Gone away?" "Yes, gone away with a Pas de Calais miner. I was afraid she would leave the 2 brats on me. But no, she took them with her. Eh? A woman who spits blood and always looks as if she were on the point of death." She mused for a moment, and then went on in a slow voice: "There's been talk on my account. You remember they said I slept with you. Lord! After my man's death that might very well have happened if I had been younger. But now I'm glad it wasn't so, for we should have regretted it, sure enough." "Yes, we should have regretted it," Étienne repeated simply. That was all. They spoke no more. A cage was waiting for her. She was being called angrily, threatened with a fine. Then she made up her mind and pressed his hand. Deeply moved, he still looked at her, so worn and worked out, with her livid face, her discoloured hair escaping from the blue cap, her body as of a good overfruitful beast, deformed beneath the jacket and trousers. And in this last pressure of the hands he felt again the long silent pressure of his mates, giving him a rendezvous for the day when they would begin again. He understood perfectly. There was a tranquil faith in the depths of her eyes. It would be soon, and this time it would be the final blow. "What a damned shammer!" exclaimed Pierron. Pushed and hustled, Maheude squeezed into a tram with four others. The signal cord was drawn to strike for meat. The cage was unhooked and fell into the night, and there was nothing more but the rapid flight of the cable. Then Étienne left the pit. Below, beneath the screening shed, he noticed a creature seated on the earth, with legs stretched out, in the midst of a thick pile of coal. It was Jeanlin, who was employed there to clean the large coal. He held a block of coal between his thighs, and freed it with a hammer from the fragments of slate. The fine powder drowned him in such a flood of soot that the young man would never have recognized him if the child had not lifted his ape like face, with the protruding ears and small greenish eyes. He laughed with a joking air, and giving a final blow to the block, disappeared in the black dust which arose. Outside, Étienne followed the road for a while, absorbed in his thoughts. All sorts of ideas were buzzing in his head, but he felt the open air, the free sky, and he breathed deeply. The sun was appearing in glory at the horizon. There was a reawakening of gladness over the whole country. A flood of gold rolled from the east to the west on the immense plain. This heat of life was expanding and extending in a tremor of youth, in which vibrated the signs of the earth, the song of birds, all the murmuring sounds of the waters and the woods. It was good to live, and the old world wanted to live through one more spring. And penetrated by that hope, Étienne slackened his walk, his eyes wandering to right and to left amid the gaiety of the new season. He thought about himself, he felt himself strong, seasoned by his hard experiences at the bottom of the mine. His education was complete. He was going away armed, a rational soldier of the revolution, having declared war against society as he saw it and as he condemned it. The joy of rejoining Pluchart and of being, like Pluchart, a leader who was listened to, inspired him with speeches, and he began to arrange the phrases. He was meditating an enlarged programme, that middle class refinement which had raised him above his class, had deepened his hatred of the middle class. He felt the need of glorifying these workers, whose odour of wretchedness was now unpleasant to him. He would show that they alone were great and stainless, the only nobility and the only strength in which humanity could be dipped afresh. He already saw himself in the tribune, triumphing with the people, if the people did not devour him. The loud song of a lark made him look up towards the sky. Little red clouds, the last vapours of the night, were melting in the limpid blue, and the vague faces of Souvarine and Rasseneur came to his memory. Decidedly all was spoilt when each man tried to get power for himself. Thus that famous International, which was to have renewed the world, had impotently miscarried, and its formidable army had been cut up and crumbled away from internal dissensions. Was Darwin right, then, and the world only a battlefield where the strong ate the weak for the sake of the beauty and continuance of the race? This question troubled him, although he settled it like a man who was satisfied with his knowledge. But one idea dissipated his doubts and enchanted him, that of taking up his old explanation of the theory the first time that he should speak. If any class must be devoured, would not the people, still new and full of life, devour the middle class, exhausted by enjoyment? The new society would arise from new blood, and in this expectation of an invasion of barbarians, regenerating the old decayed nations, reappeared his absolute faith in an approaching revolution, the real one, that of the workers, the fire of which would inflame the century's end with that purple of the rising sun which he saw like blood on the sky. He still walked, dreaming, striking his briar stick against the flints on the road, and when he glanced around him he recognized the various places. Just there, at the Fourche aux Boeufs, he remembered that he had taken command of the band that morning when the pits were sacked. Today the brutish, deathly ill-paid work was beginning over again. Beneath the earth, down there at 700 meters, it seemed to him he heard low, regular, continuous blows. It was the men he had just seen go down, the black workers, who were hammering in their silent rage. No doubt they were beaten. They had left their dead and their money on the field, but Paris would not forget the volleys fired at the Voreux, and the blood of the Empire, too, would flow from that incurable wound. And if the industrial crisis was drawing to an end, if the workshops were opening again one by one, a state of war was no less declared, and peace was henceforth impossible. The colliers had reckoned up their men, they had tried their strength, with their cry for justice arousing the workers all over France. Their defeat, therefore, reassured no one. The Montsou bourgeois, in their victory, felt the vague uneasiness that arises on the morrow of a strike, looking behind them to see if their end did not lie inevitably over there, in spite of all beyond that great silence. They understood that the revolution would be born again unceasingly, perhaps tomorrow, with a general strike, the common understanding of all workers having general funds, and so able to hold out for months, eating their own bread. This time a push only had been given to a ruinous society, but they had heard the rumbling beneath their feet, and they felt more shocks arising, and still more, until the old edifice would be crushed, fallen in and swallowed, going down like the Voreux to the abyss. Étienne took the Joiselle road to the left. He remembered that he had prevented the band from rushing on to Gaston Marie. Afar, in the clear sky, he saw the steeples of several pits, Mirou to the right, Madeleine and Crévecoeur side by side. Work was going on everywhere. He seemed to be able to catch the blows of the pick at the bottom of the earth, striking now from one end of the plain to the other. One blow, and another blow, and yet more blows beneath the fields and roads and villages which were laughing in the light, all the obscure labour of the underground prison, so crushed by the enormous mass of the rocks that one had to know it was underneath there to distinguish its great painful sigh. And he now thought that, perhaps, violence would not hasten things. Cutting cables, tearing up rails, breaking lamps, what a useless task it was! It was not worth while for 3,000 men to rush about in a devastating band doing that. He vaguely divined that lawful methods might one day be more terrible. His reason was ripening, he had sown the wild oats of his spite. Yes, Maheude had well said, with her good sense, that that would be the great blow, to organize quietly, to know one another, to unite in associations when the laws would permit it. Then, on the morning when they felt their strength, and millions of workers would be face to face with a few thousand idlers, to take the power into their own hands and become the masters. Ah, what a reawakening of truth and justice! The sated and crouching god would at once get his death blow, the monstrous idol hidden in the depths of his sanctuary, in that unknown distance where poor wretches fed him with their flesh without ever having seen him. But Étienne, leaving the Vandame road, now came on to the paved street. On the right he saw Montsou, which was lost in the valley. Opposite were the ruins of the Voreux, the accursed hole where 3 pumps worked unceasingly. Then there were the other pits at the horizon, the Victoire, Saint Thomas, Foutre Cantel, while, towards the north, the tall chimneys of the blast furnaces and the batteries of coke ovens were smoking in the transparent morning air. If he was not to lose the 8 o'clock train, he must hasten, for he had still 6 kilometres before him. And beneath his feet the deep blows, those obstinate blows of the pick, continued. The mates were all there, he heard them following him at every stride. Was not that Maheude beneath the beetroots, with bent back and hoarse respiration accompanying the rumble of the ventilator? To left, to right, farther on, he seemed to recognize others beneath the wheat fields, the hedges, the young trees. Now the April sun, in the open sky, was shining in his glory, and warming the pregnant earth. From its fertile flanks life was leaping out, buds were bursting into green leaves, and the fields were quivering with the growth of the grass. On every side seeds were swelling, stretching out, cracking the plain, filled by the need of heat and light. An overflow of sap was mixed with whispering voices, the sound of the germs expanding in a great kiss. Again and again, more and more distinctly, as though they were approaching the soil, the mates were hammering. In the fiery rays of the sun on this youthful morning, the country seemed full of that sound. Men were springing forth, a black avenging army, germinating slowly in the furrows, growing towards the harvests of the next century, and their germination would soon overturn the earth. End of Section 40. End of Germinal by Emile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis.